Personnel Affairs Committee will meet at 7 p.m. And will the clerk please call the roll?
Alderman Karen.
Here.
Alderwoman Shoshana Kelly.
Here.
Alderman at Large Lori Wilshire is here. Alderman Lopez.
Here.
Alderman Gidge is not present. We have a quorum.
Okay, fine, thank you. We'll start the meeting with public comment concerning anything that is on tonight's agenda. If you're here to speak on anything, would you please come to the mic, give your name, your address, please? Thank you. Anybody?
Would you like us to wait until you bring the legislation up to speak, or, because there are a couple of people here that want to speak to it, and I have some handouts, so.
We can do it either way. If you'd rather wait till we get to that portion of the meeting, that's fine.
Okay, so you do know I'm here for R18.
We'll invite you up at that time if
Right,
you'd rather.
66,
Yeah, we
right.
can do that, Commissioner.
Why don't we handle it that way?
All right, thank
All right,
you.
thanks very much.
Is anyone here to speak on anything else other than? Okay, then we'll move on. Interviews.
We have the Hunt Memorial Building Board of Trustees. Carolyn Morlero was unable to attend tonight, so her interview will be scheduled at our next regular meeting in October.
Okay, do we have any questions or concerns about that? Okay, thank you. Communications?
We have a communication from William McKinney, Building Department Manager, regarding legislation, Ordinance 18018, amending the Board of Building and Fire Code Appeals. I'll make a motion to accept and place on file.
Okay, and Mr. McKinney, you're here. Would you please come up and speak to the committee concerning that? You can sit if you'd like. I know that there had been some questions concerning the change, so thank you.
Yes, good evening, Chairman Karen and members of the committee. I'm here this evening in reference to an amendment to the Code of Appeals for Building and Fire Codes. If you recall, I believe it was 2 or 3 years ago, there were some significant amendments made to that ordinance. There was one piece of that that slipped through the cracks that should have been amended at that time. And basically that was language in 105-A, Appeals A, where we recommend we strike out the last line of that section, which is where the decision appealed from the results may result in manifest injustice and is contrary to the spirit and purpose of the building or fire code in public. That line is a very old line that used to be in many building codes when communities were allowed to adopt their own codes individually and could grant waivers through an appeals process. Waivers can no longer be granted to the building codes and in accordance with state statute, and also later on in our ordinance, it very clearly states that said Board of Building and Fire Codes Appeals has no authority to waive the requirements of the state building code or the state fire code. So that specific language that remained in 105-5A puts us in direct conflict with state law and our city ordinances. And we recommend that that be stricken.
Thank you for the explanation. Any questions from members of the committee? No? Okay, so the motion before you is to,
Motion is to accept the communication and place it on file.
okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion passes. Thank you, Mr. McKinney. Okay, next on the agenda, applications to license hawkers, peddlers, vendors license,
None?
appointments by the mayor.
None. none.
None. Okay. Okay, unfinished business.
We have none.
Okay, new business resolutions.
Resolution 18066, relative to addressing possible inequities in sick leave policy for certain unaffiliated employees. Just to get the discussion, I will make a motion to recommend final passage of Resolution 18066. I know we
Okay.
have a plethora of guests who would like to speak on this.
Certainly. So if, I think there's enough room if you would like to come up. And then we'll take you one at a time. So, Mr. Boudreau, I think we'll hold you till the last, okay?
If I stay here?
Yes, you may. Thank you. Okay, we'll start with Commissioner Tollner, who wanted to speak first. Please give your name.
Okay, hi, my name is Jim Tollner. I'm one of the police commissioners for the National Police Department. And yes, we're here to speak about this legislation. I know this is a topic that we have come before your committee before. Spent quite a bit of time talking to different people within the city, the HR department, the mayor, this committee. So basically, what we're trying to do, and what we'd like the city to do, is to pretty much right a wrong. And I'll just give a little perspective. Well, first, let me do this. First, let me pass this around to everybody. And so back in 2000, the city made a decision to change how the city was handling sick time, for its employees. And altogether, I don't know what the exact number of employees that were affected by this. The number has gone from 12 to 11 to 8. But regardless of what the number is, for this conversation, we can pick 12 or 11. But prior to 2000, merit employees that work for the city received 720 hours maximum sick accrual with 100% payout on retirement. Also, 100% was paid to the beneficiary upon death. In 2001, the merit system was changed for anyone that was hired after 1995. So the first most important piece for everybody to pay attention to is this was backdated 6 years. Okay, and that's the problem that we have. I think the police department has taken up the baton, and hopefully what we're asking for one person in the police department, the 10 or 11 other city employees will receive the same benefit, or similar benefit, I should say. So in 2000, the merit system was changed to read unlimited accrual with 20% payout on retirement and 50% paid on the beneficiary of death. So a couple things. We don't think it's right that the city went back retroactively and changed the benefit for these employees who are already working in the city. Okay, it's a little different when you work for a municipality. I work in the private sector, and the private sector can change these benefits, from time to time. But if you're working for a municipality and you took the job with the understanding that these were your benefits when you were hired, 6 years later to retroactively change them, we think is unfair. So in March of this year, the City of Nashua and the Board of Aldermen approved legislation that all Nashua Fire Rescue employees may accrue up to a maximum of 720 hours of sick leave and receive 100% payout of their sick time upon the retirement from the city. So this is the first thing I want to bring them to the committee's attention is about 4 or 5 months ago, we just approved this exact same thing that we're asking the city to do tonight and correct. Back in December of 2017, the mayor and the Board of Aldermen approved changes to the Teamsters contract to allow the same thing, 720 maximum hours. And there are approximately 27 Teamsters that were affected by this. And in December of 2017, the Board of Aldermen approved changes to the communication contract regarding sick time. Well, this one be a little different. The end result is somewhat similar. All communication members, including future communication members, will receive a 50% payout of sick time up to 1,420 maximum hours. So, we're just asking the committee, I know you have legislation in front of you, and what I would ask you to do is to take the legislation that's in front of you and change it to the wording I think that is included. Is it included in the second page? No? Okay. To the...
Only a couple changes, so they can...
Yeah. So there are, the amendment that I would ask the committee to replace the legislation that you have in front of you in its entirety, and just replace it when you look at the unaffiliated employees policy. And the only amendments that the adjustments that you make to that legislation is when it's talking about maximum and retirement payout, the employees hired right now it reads employees hired prior to July of 2001. I'm sorry, July 1995. Change that to 2001. It's a very simple change. Now, a number of us last week presented this request to the, and I'll ask Larry, it's called the Planning Advisory Board?
Personnel Advisory Board.
Personnel Advisory Board. There are 2 members, and I presented pretty much the same information that I'm presenting to this committee tonight, and both members of that advisory board wholeheartedly endorsed our request, thought our request was valid, and when we showed them the same information, they actually voted, both of them voted in favor of it, and they thought that the city should take this action. And the last thing I'll just leave you with is the definition of inequity. Inequity, unfairness, unjust, discrimination, and imbalance. I guess I'll save the last word for imbalance because there definitely is an imbalance here of how we're handling our city employees. Again, I only need to go back to February, March of this year, December of last year when 2 contracts were approved. And, just, I think I mentioned at the last meeting when we were here, we actually, the police commissioners approved one of those contracts in December. Okay, so there's 1 member of the police department that's affected, and there are a number of members of the different departments within the city that are affected. And the bottom line is, it's just the right thing to do. All right?
Okay. Would members of the committee like to speak now or wait till we hear from everyone?
I'd rather wait.
Okay. Commissioner?
I'm good. Just, Jim caught it right at the end there. It's doing what's right. People, you make them an offer and hire them. Let's just give them what we offered them and they accept it.
Okay.
And the other, Jim said communications people, those are the communications people at the police department. So the people who are hired now get that benefit. So it's not like this is an outlandish request.
Okay, thank you. Chief?
Thank you, Chief Lavoy. If I could, not to beat a dead horse, but I'll certainly say, plain and simple, I've never heard of anything backdated 6 years. Quite frankly, that's mind-boggling. I mean, I've negotiated dozens of collective bargaining agreements over the years, and quite frankly, because this happened to these merit employees, that's why UAW was formed. That's why several collective bargaining units were formed, because of the absolute lack of protection. So as a city, certainly collective bargaining is something that, if you're the city, I don't know, I don't want to speak for anyone in this city if you'd rather not have it or rather have all merit employees. The point is, when you treat employees unfairly, which, let's be honest, I don't know how anybody can make an argument where you backdate something 6 years to remove benefits as being anything but unfair, then, certainly you have to expect that they're going to look elsewhere and they're going to look for, different protections. The reason the Nashville Fire fighters got this a few months ago is because they deserved it. It's because it was the right thing to do. The reason these other unions, every other union in the police department and most of them in the city, to my knowledge, have recouped this because it's the right thing to do. What happened to them was wrong. Literally, our employee is one of the only ones in the entire city that has no regrets of joining a collective bargaining unit to address this situation. So is it something the city wants to do to leave her out just to hang in the wind like that? That this is a longtime valued employee. This is my executive assistant. And to me, I mean, it's absolutely the right thing to do. And, I'll be honest, I've heard some feedback about, well, the cost and this, that, and the other thing. Those are red herrings. And let's be honest about that. No one is talking about the cost when they just approved it for all these other unions. No one said a word about the cost. And now we got 1 to 11 people, depending, how you want to look at it, and now it's a cost. I mean, they would have to retire on the exact same day to even make a dent in anything. And the odds of that happening are ridiculous. So, let's be honest about it. Let's address the situation. It came to our attention. Let's do the right thing, as we should as elected officials, and as we should as police commissioners and the police chief, and to take care of valued employees. Thank you.
Okay. Before I have you speak, Steve, I just want to say that I was part of that group when they had brought this up about, instead of starting at that date, anyone hired at that point, they wanted to include all of us. We fought it. I did not know that there was a basket of 10, 15, 20 people that were left, but it has taken 11 years to get this straightened out. So whatever we do, we're trying to do for these employees, to right a wrong. So the committee and the Board of Aldermen will make the final decision, but I hope that whatever we come up with, all the employees will be happy with it, rather than not knowing that we would not fight for what's right for them. And as far as the piece that was in the policy that was changed for the fire department, that didn't come here, so that must have been when they redid the policy and procedure manual, when they made the changes for the step increases. But be that as it may, you have to understand that the committee is going to do whatever we think is fair, and then it's up to the Board of Aldermen to vote it up or down. Okay? Commissioner Tolner.
Yes, 2 things. Lori, if you could make a copy of this for the committee. I thought I had copies of it already, but make copies. The other thing, and I think I mentioned at the last committee meeting, from the police department's perspective, back when Mo Morrell was mayor, okay, Mo Morrell had sent a letter to the mayor's administration asking for this situation to be corrected. and they did not get a response. So, during the course of the last 9 or 10 months when we've been going around meeting with everybody, I just want to be very clear. It wasn't as if this happened, a number of years ago, and the police commission, it was at that time, and other that came after that, did not address it. Mo Arel had sent a letter, to the mayor's office, and follow-up phone calls, okay? And it was not addressed. So I will say that I think I can speak for, Matt is here tonight. Nick Dahl, he's down in Washington right now, otherwise he would have been here. But the two deputies and the chiefs are absolutely 100%, behind this.
That's fine.
And at the end of the day, it's the right thing to do. So what Lori is copying right now is the request that we have of this committee. And that request is to amend the legislation, removing the language that's in R 18-066 and replacing the wording in the legislation, with the information that's right here. And as you can see, this is based on conversation with a number of different people. But as you can see, this just specifically addresses the unaffiliated employees personnel policy, section B, regarding B3, sick leave. And basically all it is, for the most part, is deleting the year 1995 and replacing it with the year 2001. And if you do that, that should take care of any issues of or concern regarding, making it right for these people that have been employees for a number of years. So
Yeah, I do have a copy of the
Okay.
minutes. Thank you.
that would be our request.
Okay. Mr. Dukramon, would you like to speak?
Yes, thank you, Chairman Karen. Steve Dukran, city engineer. I started as a merit employee back in 1999. Last month would have been 19 years of service. I have not used a single hour of sick time in those 19 years. I've accumulated about 2,200 hours of sick time, which is about 55 weeks. If you do the math, it amounts to a little bit more I would have saved, but I've donated time to the sick bank. Now, I've been fortunate to be healthy, but I've also been very careful to make sure that I save sick time for only when it's absolutely necessary. So I'd heard about this change coming about from another employee. And I was around in 2001 when that change took place. We were a little bit confused as to why it didn't address us at the time. But nevertheless, rather new employee then, just 2 years into it, you didn't want to question it too much. So when I heard that they were trying to get back that benefit of going to 90 days, well, it sounds good, right? So, but there were no meetings with the staff, or the 11 or 12, or how many of us, to really explain what was going on and what the impact would be to you at a personal level. So I just, in fact, I heard that it may not be viewed upon as having any traction and getting somewhere. So didn't pay much attention. Maybe that was my fault, but if meetings weren't called, then I wouldn't know what's going on. So on last Friday, Director Budrook gave me a call and said that he wanted me to understand that there is a change to the proposed legislation, which then I took a look at, and said that what Commissioner Tolner said about just going to the 720 hours of that you as the maximum amount you can accumulate, and then getting that paid upon retirement. And then that kind of shocked me, because according to Director Boudreau, he will cut my 2,200 hours down to 720. So I'm going from 55 weeks to, how many would that be, 90 days, which is about 18 weeks. Now, that's going to wipe out that safety net that I've been creating for all these years. You know, you never can tell when you need that safeguard for a major illness. You get to my age and you start thinking about those things. In fact, just a few months ago, I canceled my short-term disability with the city because someone called to my attention, you know, with all that sick time you have, why are you paying? Why have you been for 19 years of insurance that you will never need? So I called in and canceled it, not realizing that if you get to this point, you're going to lose all that sick time. You know, I understand that there are other people here who this is going to be a good benefit for them, but they also have used that benefit of that sick time benefit throughout. You know, they've had the pleasure of using that benefit as well. So if they're down to less than half of what I have, yeah, certainly this will really work well for them, whether they're in the merit system or whether in a union employee that went to a merit system, because I understand some of them are in this position, regards to the pension, the retirement system they're in. I'm in the BPW system, so any payout will not add to my retirement benefit. So it means more to me to have my sick time on the books, at least between now and when I retire. So again, I'm not against the employees who want to do this, but I haven't had the time to digest this. It only came to light to me on Friday, and I think this needs to be evaluated further. I don't know how many more employees are in the same boat as I am in, with having very large amount of time on the books, and that will be taken away in an instant. So I think maybe the best, I know, and you'll have more discussions there, but at this point in time, I think something like this has to be tabled, especially if it's going to affect me and potentially other employees in my position.
Okay. Oh, okay, Commissioner Plant.
Could I just add one thing? The legislation as it's written now doesn't change anything for the particular police department employee we're talking about, because there's a letter in her file from then Chief Gross, which addressed this and grandfathered a certain portion of it. But that's why we're encouraging the changed legislation to correct it to where it should be.
I think would benefit Mr. Dukran as well.
Okay, well, okay, so before we ask questions, I think I'll have Mr. Boudreau speak on this. Maybe you want to talk about the legislation we have and then the proposed and how it would affect these and how many employees there are, because there are some that it doesn't affect anymore because they really had no, you know, they don't have a lot of time. Thank you.
Larry Budrow, Human Resources Director. Thank you,
Thank you for
Chairman Karen.
coming.
In March, when the unaffiliated employees personnel policy was approved by the Board of Aldermen, just a few days before that, there were some concerns brought to the aldermen about this sick leave plan and the grandfathering that took place retroactively in 2001. The chair of the Personnel Administrative Affairs and the balance of that committee asked the Board of Aldermen to move forward and approve the new legislation, and asked that the concerns that had been brought forward, there were also some concerns primarily in the Community Health Department, and those we addressed both on June 4th and had a conversation about them over the course of the summer. There are two ways, backing up for one moment, there are two ways that legislation come before the Board of Aldermen. One is if it is proposed by an alderman, one if it is proposed by a mayor. The mayor elected not to propose any new legislation. Alderman Karen and Alderman Wilshire did. That's R 18-066. And essentially what it does is it will pay people the balance of the sick time that they had on June 30th, 2001, right before this change was made. And then it will pay them 20% of their balance upon retirement. The impact of that, I'm going to give you dollars, but we just need major caveats when we talk about these dollars because there are big estimates. You have to estimate when someone is likely to retire, how much sick time they'll use before today and that time, and what their pay rate will be. All of those are educated guesses. But using the same educated guesses, the projected cost of the recommendation that Commissioner Tollner has proffered this evening was about $170,000, spread primarily between 2020 and 2035. R 18-066, the projected cost is $70,000. That difference comes from two different segments of people. One is that there are some merit employees, unaffiliated now we call them, who were hired between 95 and 2001, who had no sick pay balance in 2001, so they wouldn't benefit from that first part. Another is, and Commissioner Plant mentioned it, I wasn't aware previously of the letter, so there would not be an effect. The R 18-066 would be of no benefit to the woman from the police department here today, Ms. Markham. So that's the difference. For the people with an interest, there's $100,000 aggregate forecast over the next 18 years that would be saved by endorsing the legislation that you've submitted.
Does everyone, committee understand, members understand that? Okay, so we'll start some questions. Alderman Lopez.
So I understand the savings that was presented. I wasn't clear on how many employees, in terms of numbers, would likely be impacted in the manner that Director Dukran is.
There are five employees whose current balances are over 720. I spoke to each of them last week, and Mr. Dukran's sentiment is unique among that group.
Chief LaVoy.
Chief LaVoy with the police department. If I could just also add, Ms. Markham herself is more than twice as much sick time as the 720 is allowed. So she certainly hasn't spent her career burning up sick days. She's in fact, with this legislation, will lose quite a few sick days. But the difference is, and what matters is those sold at 20% don't come close to adding up to the 720 at 100%, which is what she had when she got hired and is what they changed. So certainly, that's a difference. So I just don't want it to be, and again, we're here to talk about our employee, and I understand that because of this, it affects others. But, Mrs. Markham has twice accumulated sick time than the 720, so she's going to lose those days, but she's going to recoup it by receiving 100% if we change this legislation to the way we feel it should be. Thank you.
Oh. Yeah, no, Alderman Kelly, please. And I'll come back.
Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate everyone coming out and kind of bringing the pieces together. I fully support this. I think that we absolutely have to right that wrong. I'm interested in sort of the background of how we got to these changes, because I noticed that a lot of the new changes are reverting back and not necessarily with the end date. So the rescue and fire reverted back to the 720, as well as the Teamsters and something else. So just interested kind of why we got where we were and what kind of inequities it's put in place.
I only have knowledge about the fire. So The old merit system was under review largely by myself and the Personnel Advisory Board for over a year, reacting to I think a 2016 recommendation by the Board of Aldermen that we refresh it. It had been dormant for a long time. And during that period of time, as we neared the completion of a draft, we sought direction, as is required by the ordinance, from the division directors, and Chief Gallipo mentioned to the Personnel Advisory Board and me that he was concerned that because there are 6 people who are unaffiliated in the fire department, the deputy chiefs, the assistant chief, and the chief, and they invariably, as I understand, except for one exception in the history of the department, are promoted from within. And so they've come out of a group that can accumulate 720 hours of sick time and receive 100% of it upon retirement. And heretofore, all of the people who had ascended through the ranks to be in that group at the top had all been hired before 1995. So it hadn't touched anyone yet. As we were pondering the new legislation, Chief Gallipo said, oh, yeah, this is not going to be as appetizing for the next set of deputy chief to get promoted because they're going to lose that benefit. Kind of a catch-22 because they would have been there for years and didn't have the liberty to go accumulate over 720 and then be subject to a new rule which would have them only get paid 20%. And so for the Personnel Advisory Board, it seemed to make good sense, and so that was introduced as part of the change in the legislation. I've not been involved in negotiating in the police department, so I can't speak to that at all, I'm afraid.
Let me do the committee members first, and then we'll come back. Alderman Lopez?
My recollection when we originally were pushing for the merit plan adjustments was because we were trying to address compression issues that were in, I believe, Department of Public Works. And I think my position particularly was trying to make sure that we didn't see additional attrition in the community health department, because it was my impression that they were becoming increasingly qualified. Their department was receiving increasing attention. I considered it to be a flight risk in a state where qualified health professionals are at an extreme premium. So that was my understanding of what we were doing at the time. I can't say that I was enthusiastic about how it was applied. I think a lot of the application of it created a lot of unrest in the community health department, and I don't think that made them feel a little more secure or particularly loyal to the city. But I can't speak for them. So what I would wonder is if multiple employees had approached you or that you would approach them trying to troubleshoot and identify, okay, who's going to be most impacted by the more recent changes, I would be worried that maybe they aren't fully able to communicate objectively what their position is, just because it doesn't seem like the comments that you've made about having met with the community health department and their satisfaction line up with what I have encountered myself. So is there a way to create the legislation so that people could voluntarily choose one option versus the other in an objective measure? Because they're not here to speak for themselves. So I would imagine if we created the amendment in a way that someone could say, I will take option A, only the people who are particularly negatively affected, it would be a way of clearly showing that they do choose what's happening versus just having it happen to them. And maybe, as Director Dukran indicated, they just weren't fully understanding of what was being presented to them on short notice.
Would you like to speak on that concern? Especially, it's only 5 people, Alderman Lopez.
May I respond?
Yes, please.
I think 2 things, Alderman Lopez. I think because I spoke to the 5 people individually, that they do understand. I also think that the legislation could have options.
Okay, Commissioner Plant, you had raised
Just
your
a little
hand.
math, based on the calculations, we're talking about $55,560 a year for 18 years. I mean, it doesn't seem like that big a deal to do what's right. What you fought for and was right then is still right now. It was right for the fire department in March. It's right now.
Alderman Wilshire?
I agree. I mean, I think for 5 people, if your math is right, I mean, we don't lose a lot. I think that's righting a wrong that shouldn't have happened in the first place. I think an option A or B might be something we could look at. I mean, certainly Mr. Dukran isn't in favor of this, so we'd like him to stick around. We like him. Well, we like his work. I don't mean him personally.
That's good to know.
Commissioner Tolna, did you have something to
I have
add?
two things. During this effort to right a wrong, I mean, you come across, when we first started out, we thought it was just the one individual. Then we have discussions. At one point, it was 20, then it was 12. So I guess the mission that we've taken on here, the police commissioner, has gained a number of people that we're trying to help through this process. I didn't know of Steve's situation until tonight, you know. I can't imagine having all that sick time, and let's be real. There's a very good chance he's not going to be using anywhere near the sick time that he's accumulated. But the bottom line here is, if God forbid, down the road he develops a serious illness, he has banked that sick time, and that sick time, since he's been here for 19, 20 years, belonged to him. I mean, the perfect example in how someone manages that situation is, you know, you buy insurance, you know, short-term care insurance. Well, where he is in his career right now, he's absolutely right. Why does he need it if he already has those hours in the bank? So it presents a problem. I'm not sure, and maybe, you know, down the next couple of days, maybe Mr. Boudreau could look at the amendments that we proposed and see how that affects Steve. I think it gets rid of the cap, so to speak. But I also like Alderman Lopez's proposal, you know, have two options. Maybe one, I was ready to say goldenrod copy because that's what we always talked about in the Board of Aldermen, but this is a canary colored copy, and then come up with something different. But Alderman Karen, you worked for the city for a number of years, doing a great job. I think if there's anybody here that understands what we're trying to do tonight, it's you, because if they tried to do this, you know, 6 months before you were to retire, I think you would find yourself in the same position as our valued employee at the police department. And the last thing I have is I have a question of Mr. Boudreau, if I could ask him
Yes,
a
you may.
question through the chair.
Yes.
And that is the Personnel Advisory Board that recommended or approved what they did for the fire department back in March.
Yes.
Is the same Personnel Advisory Board that on Thursday morning unanimously and very strongly agreed to the proposal that we presented them on Thursday morning, correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay.
I have a comment.
Alderman Lopez.
While I appreciate the support for my suggestion that we do an option, I'm not really inclined to make the amendment. I was just trying to find out if it was possible.
Okay. All right. So now I'll speak. This all started when we were trying to make the changes and the upgrades to the step in salaries for the employees. And I was approached by one of city employees concerning being left out. I did not know that. I thought it had been taken care of back in 2001 before the change came, because I know that I was going to be part of that group. They were going to, which did not make sense. So myself and the personnel group that was working at the time we fought that, and we said, that's not fair. You should start this July 1 of whatever the year is. To say that it's taken this time, all this time to try to straighten it out is a little mind-boggling, but as we know, city runs slow. So as I keep telling people who have talked about this, and I've talked to some of the 5 people that would be affected, like Mr. Duquesne, they had no problem with it. I want to make sure that we do the right thing for these 12 employees or 8, whatever it is. In figuring out how to do this, we have to work with our HR department to do it the best way we can so that everyone's happy. But also, we have to make sure that the Board of Aldermen, as a group, agrees with that. We've got to make sure we have the votes for them to say, this is the right thing to do. And to know that the mayor will eventually come on board. So those are the things that are bouncing in my head. And I don't know if we make an amendment, do we table this so that Mr. Boudreau can get some more data to us? How do we feel about Alderman Lopez's suggestion that those 5 people probably get to choose A or B? Right now, that's my dilemma. So, the committee really has to decide, do we pass this the way it is? Do we make an amendment? Do we make an additional amendment? Or do we table it for another month and try to get everything squared away so that if any questions come up from anybody else, we have the answers without hurting the legislation not getting passed. That would be my only concern for that. Alderman Kelly, you had your hand up.
I did, thank you. I wanted to know, I know you said it was estimates, how close these 5 employees might be to retirement.
I have that.
Do you have that?
May I go?
Huh?
May I respond?
Yes, you may. Thank you.
Two years, 3 years, 5 years, 5 years, 7 years.
That's eligible, right?
Oh, no, they're all eligible. That's my guess. It's pretty much fixed on age 65 unless I had a little intelligence, in which case I worked that in.
Does that answer your question, Alderman Kelly?
It does.
Okay. Alderman Wilson.
So my question would be to you, Mr. Boudreau. You talked to the 5 individuals that this would affect, this current legislation?
I talked to the 5 individuals that have a balance of over 720 hours. So like Mr. Dukran would have, if the amended legislation was what was proposed and eventually passed, people with a balance over 720 would have it shaved down to 720 because that's the maximum accrual. And so they're aware of that and have thought through it's all how you look at the benefit.
Okay, so you're saying that Mr. Dukran was the only one who didn't favor this measure?
Yes.
Thank you.
Chief Lavoy.
And if I can just reiterate that the current proposed legislation without the amendment does not affect our employee, which is what we started this ball rolling for in the first place.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Tolner.
So just to add on to the conversation about the sick time, though, is what the amended legislation does, sans Mr. Dukran, because I understand that might affect him a bit, would be guaranteeing all those employees, when they retire, they are going to get paid on 720 hours of sick time,
If they have it,
if they have it.
right, if
Right.
they haven't used any,
That-
they
right.
could
Right.
get up to 720 hours
Right,
of
so
sick
just to
time.
be clear to the Aldermanic Committee is, if it goes back to where it was when these employees were hired, they would actually get paid on that 720 hours if they had that sick time.
100%.
100% of that.
Right.
I'm sorry, yeah, yes, 100% of that. So one would think, looking at this list of these people when they were hired, I think people have seen, the list, is you'd be hard pressed to not have 700 hours of sick time if you were fortunate enough to not be sick, okay? I mean, it's pretty much assured that you would have that, and you would be paid 100% of that 720 hours of sick time.
Right.
That's a guarantee that they thought they had when they were hired.
Right. But they would start at 720 hours. They would not get any more, like Mr. Dukran has over 2,000 hours. He
Correct.
would not get that.
Correct.
Okay.
Mrs. Markham has 1,600 hours, so she wouldn't.
Right,
that
so she
either.
would drop back to 720. Mr. Boudreau and I spoke about that on Friday, 'cause after I got the information from the committee. And the more I thought of it, I said, I hope they realize that if we do that, those hours go away and you're only entitled to 720 hours. When you retire, if up to 720 hours, at the full amount, rather than 20% of,
Correct, but that's paper,
2,000.
that's really paper money unless you get sick,
abs-
okay?
I
It's paper-
understand that,
It's paper
right.
money,
I understand that.
right.
Right,
But there's one person who would prefer that, apparently. So maybe Mr. Lopez's idea could work. I'd be happy to work with you on making that legislation, make the options available if that's a possibility.
well, okay.
Would
I
that-
think, first of all, the committee has to decide whether they're going to approve the legislation as proposed, make amendments, one amendment, two amendments, or table it until we have a more definitive answers on some of these questions. Alderman Lopez.
I'm really hesitant. One of the reasons why I said I'm not inclined to make the motion myself is because I wouldn't want to try to figure out the language that's going to have such an impact on people's lives. So at the moment, I would kind of prefer that we table this for a month and that not only Mr. Boudreau and the commissioners speak about it, but make sure that legal is vetting this as well and that the amendments we do can be done.
Okay, Alderman Kelly.
I have to agree with Alderman Lopez. I think that he brought up a really interesting point, and if we're righting a right, I don't want to add a wrong at the same time, so.
Okay. Alderman Wishaw.
I'll amend my motion, which was initially to recommend final passage to table.
Okay, you heard the motion. Is there any other comments? Okay, I will just speak. I think tabling it for another month is not going to change anything for anyone. I don't think anyone's retiring tomorrow that this will affect them. And I agree, Alderman Lopez, we want to make sure we have all our ducks in a row. And however, if we do an A, B, whatever, we want to make sure legal and HR is aware of it. And we want to make sure that we're all heading in the right direction and doing the right thing for these 8 to 10, 12 employees. Is that okay? No, uh-huh.
Just have a question when they're done.
Yeah, okay, so all in favor of tabling R18066, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, so we'll table that till our next meeting. Thank you, Mr. Boudreau, we'll be in touch. Commissioner Tolner, you had a question?
Yeah, so I just had a question for people is, do we all agree that the legislation in its current form really doesn't work for any party right now?
Well, I think it did, because it was a compromise, and I think it was
if,
a good compromise. If we can do something better, that's fine with me.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, thank
Okay,
you.
I thank you all for coming.
you.
Thank you. And
Thanks.
Commissioner, if you want to speak with Mr. Boudreau, and then we'll get together. Thank you. Oh, yes. Go ahead.
I'd like to make a motion to accept the communication from Alderman Karen. It's the Personnel Advisory Board meeting minutes of September 6th, 2018. Motion to accept and place on file.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Okay, continuing on. Yeah, so we'll table. Did we make a motion? Yeah.
I make a
we-
motion to take
double check.
ordinance 18018 from the table.
Okay. This is concerning the amending Board of Building and Fire Codes appeals. You want to?
I made a
Yeah.
motion to take from the table.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay. So you listened to Mr. McKinley's response to our request from last month concerning the changes that were being proposed for the building code, and that was to get us in line with state and our own legislation. So motion is to approve final passage of 018018. Alderman Wilshire.
It's just housekeeping at this point, right? I mean, it's just cleaning up language that is obsolete, and we need to be more in line with what the state regulations are.
Correct.
Correct.
It is a housekeeping measure.
Yeah, okay.
Alderman Kelly.
As I understood it, we're actually in conflict with state law at this point without removing this, correct?
Yes, we'd be in conflict with the state statute, RSA, my apologies. (74:34).
Thank you.
Okay. So all in favor of final passage?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, motion carries. Okay, do we have any discussion? Thank you, Mr. McKinley. Alderman Wilshire.
Yeah, I mean, regarding the conversation tonight on Resolution 18066 and trying to move this forward, I guess, you know, I'd like to work with legal to figure out a good way for this to be, I'm not sure everybody's going to be happy, but at least to right a wrong that I feel has been sitting out there way too long. And, you know, it's one of those issues where if you speak up and you don't have a union backing you up, you don't have legs. And I think that's why they're here, and that's why they need us, and why we need to do the right thing by them, so.
Alderman Kelly.
Yeah, I'll just reply to that. I think that everyone who came and brought their perspectives just brought some more light to this. I think that was really important. And I think for expediency, I would love to have passed it tonight, but I think waiting a moment, making sure we get the language right and we don't create another issue I think it's worth the month turnaround.
Alderman Lopez?
I mean, what's been said is what I agree with. I think, particularly if you're not a union employee, having conversations with HR may seem more directorial or advisory than engaging in conversational. The intent for this originally was to address compression issues in that how do we make sure that people are being promoted upwards and they're continuing to seek further development and more leadership if there's no incentive for them to climb any higher? And I think that setting that up long term, you have morale issues. You have people who settle at the assistant level and aren't going to go any further but may know more than a director. It creates all these kind of conflicts. And I really think that was the thrust of the original merit plan request. So I feel like we might have kind of strayed from that and moved more to a specifically financial focus, which I appreciate, especially given the property valuations really can't be just throwing money away. But at the same time, retraining people and having miscommunication in departments are all of the reasons why we don't want compression. That saves money and that delivers better service too. So there's definitely a balance we need to strike here where we need to make sure we're treating our merit employees as well as the union ones, unless we want them to unionize. And we need to make sure that when we do something to right a wrong for one group, we're not creating a problem for another. It's very complicated. I appreciate all the work that the committee has been doing on it. There just doesn't seem to be a simple answer.
I agree. You know, when I talked about this after having a conversation with several of the employees that were involved, I felt that it was important because they never should have been put in that basket. I kept calling, you know, they were dumped in a basket and just left there. And it's a wrong that we should right. But putting a piece of legislation in doesn't necessarily make it totally right either. So if tabling it for a month helps us to satisfy everyone, and we're doing the right thing, and we can get this passed, and then, you know, we're back to square one, I am perfectly happy, and I don't mind working. Mr. Boudreau has been very cooperative when I've asked him for information and whatever has been going on, but we certainly want to make sure legal, if we decide to do what your suggestion was, to give them the option, then we want to make sure that legal has that down pat, so we don't have any questions moving forward. So I appreciate all the input. I think it was very informative, and I think in the end, the employees will be happy. I really do. Alderman Lopez and then Alderman Webster.
I just wanted to comment too that I commend Engineer Dukran for coming forward because that's a very difficult position to be in. I'm sure somebody in the Telegraph or whatever is going to comment that he was just looking after his own benefits, but he didn't create the situation. At best, what he did was work every day and make sure that he didn't get sick and showed up for his job. And I think that with respect to what Chief Lavoie and Commissioner Tollner were pointing out, there is that agreement that kind of commitment should be recognized. So I appreciated the fact that he came up and gave the issue a face because that can be a challenge for people. I think it can be difficult to make that argument and open yourself up to people questioning your motives and your intentions. And I suspect he may have spoken on behalf of more people than were necessarily comfortable doing that themselves. He's very knowledgeable. He's done a great job with everything that I've seen. He dedicates a lot of hours, like cheerfully, professionally, and enthusiastic to things like zoning board and the different commissions that he's on. So I really appreciate his work and that he came here to defend it, basically.
I agree. You know, I think putting a face and having him come here, he's really putting himself out there, and I appreciate that about him. He's a class act. I just wanted to make another motion. I'd forgotten to make a motion to accept the communication from Commissioner Tollner. So my motion would be to accept and place on file the communication from Jim Tollner regarding the retro merit fix information.
Okay. So you heard the motion concerning the communication from Commissioner Tollner. All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion carried. Okay. So we've had our remarks by the alderman. There's no need for a non-public, so motion.
Make a motion to adjourn.
Motion by Alderman Wilshire to adjourn. All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion carried at 8:05 PM. Meeting is adjourned. Thank